As many of you know, I'm Norton Mezvinsky, the president of the International Council for Middle East Studies, and I welcome you here today. Don Wallace, the chairperson of the board of directors, also sends you his greetings. He had to be overseas on a working vacation, and he sends his regrets, especially to the speaker, but also to the whole audience. Please come in, we're just starting. That he can't be here today. Now, today's event, as we announced, is the inaugural International Council for Middle East Studies, ICMES, Ibrahim Abu Rabi Annual Lecture. I'll introduce the speaker after I've said a few words about my very good friend, Ibrahim Abu Rabi, who was one of the directors of ICMES. Ibrahim Abu Rabi, as I'm sure many of you know, was a prolific and creative scholar. His book and articles were highly praised, and they established him as a distinguished scholar in the field of modern Islamic thought. As the chief editor of the journal, the scholarly journal, The Muslim World, he raised the level of that publication. Ibrahim was also a very popular and extremely outstanding teacher. His premature death from a heart attack in Amman, Jordan, on July 2nd of 2011, just before he was scheduled to return home to Edmonton, Canada, just shocked friends and scholars in many parts of the world. Ibrahim was a Palestinian, born in Nazareth, he, by his mid-50s, that's how old he was when he died, he already had become a major spokesperson, a major academic spokesperson for Islam. After studying at Birzeit University in the West Bank of historic Palestine, Ibrahim went to and earned his PhD at Temple University. And then after he got his PhD, he then had two short teaching engagements at the University of Texas and Virginia Commonwealth before he went to the Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut in 1991 as a professor. He was appointed professor in the McDonald Center for the study of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations. In 2008, he left the seminary to become the first holder of the chair in Islamic studies that was established at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. In addition to being a superb scholar, Ibrahim in many ways was a public intellectual. He did a great deal of Muslim-Christian interfaith group coordination and work. He led groups of people. He led groups of people in study guide tours to Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Pakistan, North Africa, and Indonesia. And he brought students and faculty from abroad to study. He brought them to study first at the Hartford Seminary, and then he brought them to study at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He was, in 2006, he was a senior Fulbright scholar, and he spent the year in Malaysia doing teaching and doing interfaith work. And I want to sort of add a personal note here in terms of this kind of thing that he did. He took me with him to Syria, to Turkey, to Lebanon, and to Pakistan, sometimes just the two of us, and sometimes with a few other people. And we went to discuss and lecture with political leaders, academics, and others. And I must say that I will always be indebted to him because for me, he opened up these opportunities for me to do this kind of work that was terribly important. Now, there were a few major themes in what Ibrahim did. He emphasized the mystical tradition, as I'm sure many of you know in Islam, usually referred to as Sufism. Ibrahim here stressed the broader category of religious experience and not simply institutional forms. He also concerned himself with political Islam. He developed a deep interest in, and he arranged in-depth, he analyzed in-depth ideas and interpretations of Said Nursi, the famous Turkish Islamic theologian, paying special concern to Nursi's philosophy of nonviolence. And Ibrahim also expressed his Palestinian heritage in his teaching and in many public discussions. Finally, Ibrahim wrote sensitive poetry. And what I'd like to do, I'll just take another moment or two. I want to read you one of his poems that was published along with other articles in this commemorative issue of the scholarly journal Religious Studies and Theology that was devoted it was a commemoration. It was devoted to Ibrahim Abu Rabi, and it begins before the articles with one of his poems, and it ends with another one of his poems. And as I said, these poems, I think, indicate his sensitivity. This poem is titled, "Only Through Your Love Can We Survive," dedicated to the children who lost their parents in the tragic attacks on the USA on 9/11/2001. A poem by Ibrahim Abu Rabi. I fix my gaze on your eyes, trying to fathom the depth of your anguish and the extent of your pain. When your parents kissed you goodbye that morning, it never crossed your minds that you would never meet again. Buried under the rubble, the bodies of your loved ones have dotted our emotional landscape and have made you closer to our hearts than ever. Your pain has thrown us into the unspoken pain of the millions of suffering children around the world just like you. We feel as though our raison d'etre, foundation, and identity has been shattered beyond belief. However, your beautiful and sad eyes give us a glimmer of light, hope, and anchor. We tread the path of agony, this time not alone, but in unison with you. We surrender ourselves completely to you. You have become our guide, just like the sage in Dante's Divine Comedy. You have become our teachers, giving us lessons in love, humility, and compassion. We see on the horizons the beginning of a new dawn. We see your compassionate smile taking us by the hand in the new darkness surrounding the world. Your proximity to us has made life meaningful again. Yes, we will overcome this tragedy together. Yes, we will overcome it together with the suffering children of the world. When, we do not know. The world seems to be poised on creating more suffering for children like you, but we are sure that one day we will overcome. We are sure that one day your smile will melt down all the anger excuse me, and hatred in the world. I'm sorry. But as I said, he was my very good friend. No. Now, I'll take a little pause and catch myself. All right. We're very pleased to have a very distinguished speaker today for the inaugural, as I said, Ibrahim Abu Rabi Lecture. Carl W. Ernst is a specialist in Islamic studies with a focus on West and South Asia. His published research, based on the study of Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, has been mainly devoted to the study of three areas, general and critical issues of Islamic studies, pre-modern and contemporary Sufism, and Indo-Muslim culture. He has received research fellowships from the Fulbright Program, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and he has been elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His publications, which have received several international awards, include Following Muhammad, Rethinking Islam in the Contemporary World, 2003, which has been translated into Arabic, Persian, Turkish, German, and Korean. Trained in comparative religion at Stanford University and getting his PhD at Harvard University, he is now William R. Kennan Jr. Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and co-director of the Carolina Center for the Study of Middle East and Muslim Civilizations. We're very happy to have Professor Ernst with us here today. Professor Ernst. You don't get that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Norton, for a very kind and generous introduction. Can everybody hear me? Okay. It's an honor to be invited to give the inaugural Ibrahim Abu Rabi lecture. I knew him and admired his scholarship, and he will be missed. So it's fitting that he should be remembered with a scholarly activity like this lecture, which aims at reaching larger audiences. And so I'm very pleased to be associated with this activity and with the council. I'll begin with a couple of problems which lie in the language that is all too commonly used to define our current situation, but which on analysis creates difficulties for us. One of them is a very widely used pair of terms which are juxtaposed as opposites, something called the West and something called Islam. These are not exactly parallel terms. The West, when you think about it, suggests a geographical designation, but it's a confusing one because west of what? Who gets included in the West? Is it actually an ideological term? Is it a technological designation? Is it for developed nations in economic terms? I mean, it's rather vague, I think, when one looks to it a little more closely. But I think that this pairing testifies a kind of a deep psychological impulse in the post-Cold War era to find another opponent that would take the place of the Soviet Union. But it also reflects long-standing prejudices and stereotypes which cast Islam as a hostile other that is opposed to European civilization and is irretrievably different. But I'm going to lay out a few reasons why this is true as a historian, and I'm going to go back into a couple of examples from the early stages of Islamic civilization, but I also want to talk about contemporary issues as well, because I think it's important that we have a sense of history, because in America, frankly, there are a lot of people who don't. And we need to, as scholars, bring that out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach to public scholarship as we go along. I'm going to allude to some of the complex and multiple sources of Islamic civilization, including the Greek tradition, which many people in Europe and America assume is the unique property and inheritance that is owned by Western Europeans. And they are not aware of the fact that this actually has a very important role to play in the Middle East and farther east than that. I also would like to just highlight the importance of the colonial era, something which many people in America, I find my students, for instance, and even well-educated people, are relatively ignorant about. Because when you say colonial, they think about Williamsburg, Virginia, and people wearing funny hats, and it's rather benign and kind of a fantasy of something that doesn't suggest empires founded upon military conquest with intelligence agents and with severe effects on the local economies, devastating effects on local culture, and untold results that continue to play out in the contemporary world, even decades after the nominal end of colonialism. And it's also noteworthy that if you look at the extent of Muslim populations around the world, if you trace the colonial era from Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1796 until the end of World War I with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, close to 90% of Muslim populations were conquered by a military invasion of either European or, if you take the case of Chinese, other powers. And so colonialism played a very important role in the history of Muslim societies, and consequently it also opened up the door to an experience of European culture that was not a voluntary one, but which was imposed. And this is why we have French and English as the languages that are so widely spread in Africa and the Middle East and South Asia. So this is something else which needs to be documented. And as a historian of Islamic thought, I'd like to point out too that the term Islam has had a history and has had some changes in its connotations and implications. In Quranic language, the term Islam is not a dominant term. It is much more important for the Quran to think about Iman or faith, and Islam is a relatively less common term. But we find the term coming up with much greater frequency in the 19th century and the 20th century, where it actually becomes identified, I think, it can be argued, with the identities of those who have been subjugated to colonial domination. As the largest single identifiable group that were under colonial conquest, Muslims actually became aware of that identity in a new sense, and so the social consequences of that, I think, are interesting as well. And these are in no particular order, but we think a lot about globalization as a process that ostensibly is bringing together the different parts of the world in a kind of a network of exchange and contact. But what I think we often fail to recognize is the extent to which it's a one-way, a one-directional phenomenon. In other words, if you do a check of the resources at UNESCO, which follow the translations of language, of works from one language to another, for every book translated from Arabic into English, there are 8 books translated from English into Arabic. For Persian, it's 12-1. For Turkish, it's 16-1. And so in Iran, there are intellectuals who are debating about the theories of science of Karl Popper and Habermas and the philosophy of Richard Rorty and so forth. But I would challenge you to find many American academics who could name a single intellectual from the Arab world, from Iran, or from Turkey who has a serious engagement with their thinking. So I have some alternatives to propose to this kind of dualistic opposition of the West versus Islam, which I think has terrible consequences for our understanding of culture and politics today. So I'd also like to connect this with another topic, which is Islamophobia. It's a term which is relatively recent, which was highlighted in a 1997 report in England. And there's some debates about the term and what it means and how useful it is. But a couple of years ago, I was asked as a member of the board of directors of the Middle East Studies Association to organize a plenary session on Islamophobia at its annual meeting. So I had the opportunity to invite the very top scholars in the field to address this issue very incisively, and it was extremely successful. And so we ended up putting out a volume on the subject. And as the editor, I was called upon to introduce this subject, and it was a rather difficult subject to deal with. And I had to spend time on a lot of websites that made me very uncomfortable. But I think this is a really important subject, and one of the things I I had been collecting material on this for the last 15 years. I had a huge dossier on it, and it's quite clear that what we call Islamophobia is, although it draws upon older residues of anti-Islamic prejudice, it's clearly connected to contemporary racism and anti-Semitic hostilities, and very frequently is prominent among the very same circles that used to openly avow racial prejudice and anti-Semitism, but which now conceal that. It has also become a tool for political advantage, which is being cynically manipulated by politicians. And I won't go into details on this, but I think many of you can think of examples in recent history in America where this has been played out in public in a rather unpleasant fashion. But what's also very significant to me is that Islamophobia is not really about religion, in my opinion. Because, to be honest, most people in America don't know anything about Islam. It's really a question about citizenship. On the one hand, and the survey data is quite interesting, people seem to really want to agree that Muslims should have the right to build mosques and to practice their religion freely. They don't really balk on that issue. But when it comes down to it, are Muslims American enough culturally? This is the kind of question that comes around. So when we picked the cover for this book, I thought this was a very effective way of describing this sort of very minimal hostility. There is no intellectual program here, but it is being manipulated by certain interests in a very nasty way. So I think we need to bring attention to this in a responsible fashion. So the points that I wanted to make to you today, I sort of developed in a book that came out some years ago, which was called Following Muhammad, Rethinking Islam in the Contemporary World, and the subtitle for that is what our topic is for today. And I'm delighted to see a couple of people here who've actually used the book in their courses, and so I've had a really tremendous response to this. And I wanted to say something about public scholarship, as I indicated a moment ago. There are many scholars who become highly trained in an academic specialty and succeed very well in writing a doctoral dissertation which is written for the smallest possible audience, 5 people. And there are many scholars who continue to write in the same style for the rest of their lives. And this is what gives, scholars a bad name, and so when something is dismissed as being just academic, that's what people have in mind. Complicated academic jargon that doesn't really connect to an audience. So I've been working for some years in trying to develop a language and a style of writing that would be accessible, free of unnecessary jargon, and which connects to the audiences that really are keenly interested in these subjects. And I use a technique which I refer to, I'm revealing my secrets here today. I call this stealth analysis. In other words, the technique is to introduce the important critical questions, but without showing off with all that technical language. And I think this can be done, and it can be developed in that really great laboratory which we have, which is the university classroom, but also with public audiences as well. And I think what people really are looking for is to be empowered to understand subjects on their own rather than to be lectured at or given a series of bullet points. And so I'd be happy to talk more about this with anyone either individually afterwards, but I think I'm trying to convince my colleagues to develop this type of technique because they risk becoming irrelevant if they stick to that specialized language. So I had a couple of objectives when I did this book, and by the way, I had another experience when I wrote this. I was actually commissioned by a publisher probably about 1999 or 2000, and then I was actually writing it during 2001 when I was living in Spain for a few months, and that's when 9/11 happened, and I ended up expanding one section of the book, which was the part about the concept of religion. and because I think that people don't understand the way in which the history of religion has developed over the centuries, and how there is a European concept of religion which had a very key role in colonialism. But I also had an experience there, and if you want to hear about this, I can enlarge on this in the questions. But the publisher of the book decided that they didn't want to be associated with a subject like Islam, and they rejected the manuscript for completely unscholarly reasons. But that was the mood of that moment. At any rate, I felt that when I was asked to summarize what the argument was I was trying to make, I came down to a couple of things. First of all, Muslims are human beings. This might seem to be setting the bar fairly low. But I think it's fair to say that what we have seen actually over the last, not only the last 15, 20 years, but for a long time previously, is that there's a kind of a dehumanization of Islam in the news media and in popular culture. And it's understandable in effect that many Americans, and to a certain extent in Europe as well, people don't know Muslims as part of their own communities. And so there is a kind of reliance upon media representations which tend towards the sensational, the violent, the theatrical, and the foreign, and the exotic. And so there's also a stereotype involving Islam, which is that Muslims are religious all the way down. So if you just read the Quran, you will understand everything that goes on with Muslims. Now, scholars of Islamic studies are quite aware that the Quran does not explain everything about Islam. There is quite a bit of religious history after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. There's the Prophet himself, there's the development of Islamic law, there's philosophy, there's ethics, there's art, culture, there's politics, there's many different things. But basically speaking, if you just approach Muslims entirely through the lens of a very narrow definition of religion, this means that history is irrelevant, ethnicity is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if someone's rich or poor, what ethnic group they come from, whether they're from the city or from the country. All the variables that we know from our own experience are the conditions of being human are eliminated by this stress upon a narrow religious stereotype. And so I think it's incumbent on us to ask the questions, who are we talking about, where are they, and what do we really know that is beyond simply the mere fact that they are identified as Muslims. And secondly, and you may want to argue with me on this, but I'd like to suggest that we stop thinking about a concept of a Muslim world. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a problem in this kind of dyadic opposition of the West versus Islam. But I'd like to suggest that there is no separate planet that is inhabited exclusively by Muslims and which is completely unconnected with Europe and America and the rest of the world's history. This is a ludicrous concept if you take it to its extreme. The last time I checked, there is one world which we are all part of. And so if we could use that as the unit of analysis, we would have a very different picture than if we have this sort of separate Muslim world out there. There's also another place that's uncomfortably situated next to it. There's the Arab world and the Muslim world, and this is all thrown around as if they're independent units that are completely hermetically sealed. That's a very incomplete picture at best. So I think that if we change our language, this can help us to come up with a different picture of the world. If we change the terms of debate, and if we provide a new kind of opening for discussion, there's an opportunity to actually change stereotypes and to change the conversation. And what I think the ultimate goal is in this kind of exercise is to humanize Muslims for those who have been alienated from them. Now, I'm going to give one case study today, which I think will be helpful to illustrate both the complex history of an important topic in the history of Islam and also the way in which it has been overlapping with and engaged with so-called Western civilization in both positive and negative ways. And so I'm going to take the case of ethics. And ethics includes a huge range of material which is recommended, normative, required, lawful, etc., and which can include considerations of basic right and wrong, what is criminal, what is not, but which also includes things which you might call customary practices, because ethics will include practices that are not necessarily, I mean, it's one thing to say that murder is a crime that should be rejected and punished, but what about dietary prescriptions that don't have, you know, an obvious universal recognition? That can be part of ethics too, and that's part of what makes a particular religious tradition distinctive. And it's part of custom, tradition, and it's honored, and it's related to founders, etc. So I want to just kind of go through this quickly, but it provides us an example of a way we can think about Islam in the contemporary world in a slightly different fashion than this old dyadic opposition. So I'll talk a little bit about reason and authority in religious ethics, scriptural ethics, in which I'll talk just a bit about the Quran and the Hadith sayings of the Prophet. And then a very important early chapter is the engagement with Greek philosophical ethics in Islamic civilization. And, and then finally, what was a more hostile engagement was during the colonial period, what happens to Islamic ethics under contact with European and other outside powers. So this is an occasion for us to think through some thoughts regarding Islam and how it relates to other theaters. So there are a number of passages in the Quran that address the issue of ethics in a very interesting way, and this particular verse from Surah 5 is one of the ones which talks about the divine plan, including a number of different ethical and legal and religious prescriptions. There are a number of such passages in the Quran. I think they're very interesting, and it is difficult to avoid the impression that the Quran reflects this notion that there are multiple religious traditions and ethical ways, and they, ideally speaking, should try to compete on the ethical level. That's the meaning of the last phrase there, try to excel in doing what is best. I'm just throwing this out as an interesting framework, which is actually hard to find parallels for in other scriptures, the notion that there are multiple dispensations that are of divine origin. And when we talk about scriptural ethics, and we're going to go from the sort of scriptural sources of the Quran and the Hadith to the interaction with the Greeks in just a moment. And the reason why I want to do this is because I think one can argue that ethics is generally based upon either reason or authority. In other words, ethics based on reason is using, for instance, the notion that murder, theft, and other crimes of violence are unlawful because they break up the fabric of society and they make it impossible for people to live together. So you can construct a rational argument about why these are wrong. You can also have an argument from authority because God says it's wrong. And that's a different argument. But there is always a mixture of both reason and authority in appeals to ethics. That's my argument. Now, the term that we normally use in Arabic today is akhlaq, which is a kind of plural word like the Greek word ethics is based upon a plural word in Greek, and mores in Latin. It means approved standards of behavior, what the things are that you should and should not do. And it's kind of interesting that it's multiple things. And the Quran has many different references to ethical behavior, and I think of a couple of passages that are very significant. One which is about the so-called mithaq, or the primordial covenant between God and the souls of humanity before they were created in bodily form, where God asked the souls of humanity, "Am I not your Lord?" And they answered, "Yes." And for many, this exchange was an acknowledgement of divine authority and of the obligation of humans to respect the commandments of God. And there's also an important passage, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. We shall show them our signs on the horizons and within their souls. That, in other words, God displays the signs both externally in nature as a kind of indication of divine creativity and the consequent responsibility of humanity to be grateful for those favors and to be obedient, but also within the soul themselves. And this is kind of interestingly similar to what Plato said about the origins of philosophical thinking in the observation of the heavens above us and the movement within the soul itself. I'm not going to try to go into the details of Quranic ethics, but I thought I would just give a little display here of something that's kind of parallel. Now, a hadith collection is based upon the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are called hadith, and which are a secondary source of normative authority next to the Quran, and from which Muslims derive a code of conduct called the sunnah, or the example of conduct. And so I was just using this particular example. There's a collection of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. There's a particularly popular one called the Mishkat. Actually, it's Mishkat al-Masabih. There's a misprint there. And this is organized by subject. And it's kind of interesting to look over the table of contents here. And so at the beginning, you have a lot of subjects which look very religious, right? Faith, religious knowledge, purity, prayer, funerals, alms, fasting, virtues of the Quran, invocations, names of God, pilgrimage. This is all very obviously falling into the religious category according to most people's thought. Then you get to commerce. That's kind of interesting. Marriage rules, freed slaves, punishments, governing injustice, jihad, hunting and sacrifice. Some of this sounds like politics and government and law. And then we get into foods, clothing, medicine and divination, dreams. This has to do with custom, with psychology, and then the last ones are kind of interesting. Manners, softening the heart. You know what softening the heart is? It's talking to people nicely. So it's interesting to see the range of subjects which are covered by this kind of compendium of religious ethics. It's quite broad. And so a lot more could be said about this. In other words, to what extent are texts going to be the foundation of judgments about what is right and wrong? Particularly since it covers such a wide range of things, including psychological elements. That suggests that the role of ethics is very broad indeed. And once again, there's the question of ethical universality. To what extent do these kinds of prescriptions appeal beyond one particular source of authority? But I'm always fascinated about the whole episode about Greek philosophy entering into the composition of Islamic civilization. It's one of a number of streams of ancient civilization which were very important for the formation of Islamic civilization. There was, of course, the establishment of a very important empire by the early Arab caliphs, and there was a gradual process of conversion that took place over centuries. I think that most scholars would estimate that between the early Arab conquests beginning around the middle of the 600s, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, up through the year, say, 1000, Muslims, although they became rulers, they were very thinly spread over a huge area from Spain to India, and were probably a minority for at least 4 or 5 centuries. And so there were many other peoples involved in this empire, many other religious groups, and the Greeks and the Persians were among the most significant. And so one of the great cultural transfers of knowledge that took place during this time was the translation of Greek philosophy and science into Arabic. And this was supervised in Baghdad beginning around the year 800 by the Caliph and by important figures at court. And it was an international and multi-religious activity in which translators included Muslims, Christians, Jews, and also the pagans who were known as the Sabians, who sort of took on an identity from a Quranic reference, but were actually still more or less like the people who had studied with Plato back in the days of the academy in Athens. Now, this included, of course, mathematics, science, and metaphysics, and so forth, but ethics and politics were part of this. And so when we find philosophers like Al-Farabi talking about the full range of knowledge, it's interesting that when he took the treatise of Aristotle on politics, he said this is Islamic theology and law. So he was taking this term of politics and ethics and translating it as Islamic law and theology. And I won't go into this in detail, but I don't think there's any question about the fact that this translation movement had an enormous impact and introduced logic and categories of thinking which permeated all of the sciences. And so the development of a subject like Islamic law, jurisprudence, and theology cannot be understood without the vocabulary that was based upon the Greek models. I mean, there were arguments that took place, and as we know, there were thinkers like Al-Ghazali who rejected the metaphysical implications of the theories of Aristotle because it was incompatible in his view with aspects of Islamic monotheism and the creation of the world by God, etc. But the tools that Al-Ghazali used were undisputably linked to Greek philosophy. And so we have to understand this as a formation of a new civilization with a very complex adoption of powerful tools that had been developed previously. And there are other ethical sources in Islamic civilization that are worth taking note of. The traditions of empire are based on kingship. And although the language that was used imparted certain kinds of Islamic legitimacy to it, for instance, the term sultan is a word which is an Arabic word meaning proof. Sultan Allah would be the proof of God. This was an Islamic title that was given to people who had become kings by the rule of force. The institute of kingship does not come out of the Quran. It's very ancient. And Alexander the Great is an example of a world conqueror who exerted an enormous impact on the imagination of later civilizations, and who many would argue is represented in the Quran under the figure of Dhul Qarnayn. But the early caliphate was clearly looking to the models of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, which was an incredibly powerful institution, totally overthrown by the Arab armies, but they adopted many of the features of Persian kingship in the political institutions of the caliphate. And the ethics of India were also known and part of the political culture of the early Islamic civilization, because there was a translation movement also going on from Sanskrit into Persian and Syriac and Arabic, and the well-known collection of fables, it becomes known as Qalila wa Dimna in Arabic, but was translated into practically every conceivable language of the Middle East and appears in Thomas Caxton's 15th century, 16th century English publications. These became the kind of stories that modeled the nature of political authority and ethics in government. And there are other stories to be told, including the way in which Chinese Muslims interacted with Confucian ethics. And a number of scholars have recently been doing work. I'm thinking of Sachiko Murata in particular. There is a Chinese Islamic literature that arises in the 17th century, which is deeply imbued with Sufi concepts of mysticism and philosophy, but which uses a vocabulary that is indistinguishable from the Neo-Confucian philosophy of high Chinese literature. And so there is a remarkable kind of integration going on here with multiple modes of civilization. There are a couple of other things which are worth adding to this, one of which is local custom. There are a couple of terms for this in Islamic jurisprudence, adat and urf. But Islamic legal scholars acknowledge that local custom, which had nothing to do with Islamic sources, was a legitimate source of normative behavior. And there is a great deal that goes on in terms of local customs in India among Muslims, which is very different than what is done in Africa. And so to exclude this from the viewpoint of Muslim societies would be, in my mind, hard to justify, because it would be treating Islam as a very narrow range of authoritative references. And also administrative edicts of rulers. These clearly do not come out of religious sources, although religious authorization, religious legitimacy was often claimed by rulers. In other words, they would associate themselves with religious authority. But it's very interesting to see that in many imperial situations, the Muslim jurists who worked for the sultans produced the rulings that the sultans wished. It was the independent jurists who were not part of the imperial structure who had greater independence. So let's go to one more example, which is the colonial era, and I want to give you some examples of what happens to ethics and some of the, it's really complex what's going on. It's not a one-way situation. But in terms of education, which is where we find the imparting of knowledge and the transmission of authority and normative texts. In northern India, there was a very interesting curriculum which was called the Dars-e-Nizami, named after a particular scholar named Nizamuddin, which was distinctive for its very strong emphasis on the intellectual and rational tradition. In other words, which included logic, philosophy, and even science, including astronomy, as part of the curriculum. And this was well established by 1700, and it lasted pretty much until British colonial rule was cemented during the middle of the 19th century. It's still referred to today in India and Pakistan, and people in their different institutions will claim to be actually using this, but they're just really referring to the name. It's actually quite different. But what happened in the colonial era, and this is quite well established by current research, is that traditional sources of patronage for education and scholarship became eliminated as local dynasties were overthrown, and therefore the support for these philosophical and learned circles basically evaporated. And by 1830, for instance, the British announced that English was going to become the language of administration. And so if you wanted to be advanced and get a job, you had to forget about the classical languages. And so the new institutions that get founded during this period follow the kind of defeat of Muslim military prestige and power, including the 1857 revolt against the British. After that, there were very different direction was taken. And so perhaps one of the better known institutions in South Asia is the Deoband Academy, which began in a particular town of that name in 1867, and which has a widespread network of millions of adherents today throughout Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. And what's interesting about it is, if you look at the curriculum, is it's very scripturally focused. They completely dropped all of the intellectual tradition of rational philosophy, logic, and so forth, and it's all focused on hadith. And they had no longer any dependence upon the political authorities of the traditional aristocracy. They instead went to the public for support. And they became a modern institution with bureaucracy, with catalogs, with the kind of organizational style of a British university. But there were new styles of piety and ethics that were affected by this British experience of colonial rule. And there are other changes that take place. For instance, as with changes in European and American law, slavery was eventually rejected. As we know, this took longer in some places than others. I speak as a descendant of slaveholders in the American South. But other things happened that were quite remarkable, one of which was the transformation of the instruments of Islamic law, of Sharia, into a legal code. Now, this is actually a pretty momentous kind of transformation, and I'm relying on the work of scholars like Wael Halak, who argues that what happens under the colonial system is that the case law of Sharia practice had previously allowed jurists a considerable degree of independence in making judgments because they were not bound by an inflexible system of legal precedent, which is the norm in the common law tradition of England and America, and the Napoleonic and Roman codes as well. So what happens is that Islamic law gets turned into a code, and it was being administered by British and French officials, for instance, in France and elsewhere. And in India and in Pakistan, they still have the system which has the remarkable name of Anglo-Mohammedan law. I did not make this up. But it was based upon translations of a very limited set of texts on Islamic law, translated into English and interpreted by British officials in sometimes very remarkable and unexpected ways, supposedly with consultation with Muslim scholars, but it was a different system. It became a different system, and frankly, I think that's a very surprising transformation. There are new subjects that are coming up today. There are debates about gender. This is not a surprise. This is happening in Judaism. This is happening in Christianity. It's happening everywhere. It's part of global transformations. But there are debates about gender and Islamic law today, and there are people who want to have a new discussion about what that means in today's society. Other things happen in terms of ethics and political thinking. For instance, the introduction of European social and economic thought. There is a remarkable book by a scholar named Charles Tripp, which is called Islam and the Moral Economy. In this study, he examines the way in which the notion of society as a concept, which was developed by 19th century thinkers like Herbert Spencer, was translated into Arabic as ijtima', but became normalized as a way in which people reflected about their own identity. And so it's totally common in modern Arabic for people to talk about what is the nature of Islamic society. But this was a phrase that would not have been conceivable before the 19th century and before the translation of this concept. So what does it mean when you have a term like that that it now becomes normalized and introduced as a way of thinking about your own self? And the same is true with the concept of religion. I mean, there is a term in Arabic that is oftentimes considered to be the equivalent of religion, and this is deen. But if you look at this term, it actually has a lot of different implications than the word religion. And I would argue that religion eventually, in the history of Christianity, evolved into a situation where it used to be that ancient Christian writers like Augustine would talk about true religion as a singular entity. And it meant the acknowledgement of God with piety and the adherence to his authority. But the Protestant Reformation led to the notion that there are multiple religions. And eventually, the Christians decided to declare truce between the Catholics and the Protestants. But that left the others as opponents. And basically, it was considered to be there were only three other major religions: the Jews, the pagans, and the Muslims, which are usually referred to as the Turks in those days. But basically, the notion of multiple religions was articulated at a moment when colonialism really began to move, and the notion of which religion would be dominant over the world was a major question that was inseparable from colonial expansion. So this affects the way in which people understand the notion of deen and other terms within Islamic religious thought. Finally, the modern nation state is a new entity that we have experienced since, let's say, the French Revolution. It is a form of social and political organization that is vastly more powerful than any of the empires of the ancient world. It has powers over citizens which were inconceivable to our ancestors. And the nation state everywhere defines religion. You know who defines religion in the United States? The Internal Revenue Service and other agencies of the government. And nation states around the world have constitutions which define the role of religion and which are the legitimate religions and what is a reference to religion for the legal system, etc. The state defines religion, it's not the other way around. So these are all ways in which concepts of religion and ethics have changed over time by interaction with multiple civilizations. So I'm using this historical demonstration to suggest the impossibility of a simplistic stereotype and a boiling down Islam to a particular notion of authoritarian religion. And if I'm correct on this point, Muslim thinking on right and wrong, on what people do in their daily lives, draws on multiple sources, and there has been change that has taken place over time in the development of these concepts. And this is not surprising in some ways because the Quran itself refers to different types of religious dispensation that are divinely approved. And there's a very well-known saying of the Prophet Muhammad to seek knowledge even if it is in China. So that kind of complexity is something which I think is very important for us to keep in mind. What are the implications of what I've just presented to you? Going back to that first 2 points that I wanted to make. First of all, I think that this historical exploration helps us to work against a dehumanizing form of argument which I call essentialism. In other words, there is an approach to religion which assumes that religion has an essence that is unchanging over time, which is to deny the history of religion. Admittedly, there are landmarks that remain, but the interpretations change and there are new developments that come in. And there are people who appear and centuries after the founder and will make the claim that they are returning to the original source and restoring it to its pristine condition. They are arguing for time travel. Time travel does not exist. It is a rhetoric that makes a claim of return to the source, but it is taking place in a totally different situation. So we need to understand location, historical context, social variables, and not the kind of abstractions which are the source of those stereotypes and simplifying pictures. The second thing is that, and I don't have to elaborate this point, I think this historical demonstration helps us against those warnings of civilizational conflict. The people like Bernard Lewis with his Clash of Civilizations were basically trying to provide, or in effect supplying, a blueprint for conflict and war, which was eagerly adopted by certain interests. It is not based upon a factual or justifiable understanding of history, and it has been criticized and rejected by most of responsible scholarship. So the conclusion that this leads to is not a shocking one to those of us who are here. The Muslims are part of a single world that we all inhabit. So the final question, and this is a question which I pose because I care a great deal about this, and yet it's one which is going to take the efforts of many thoughtful people to pursue. Is it possible for us to establish ethical communities that are not defined by national, ethnic, or religious loyalties exclusively? Those variables are always going to be there, but I think we need to go beyond the simple dualities and oppositions of one group versus another, or we won't have much of a world to offer to our children and grandchildren. So rethinking the nature of Islamic identity in the contemporary world is an important issue, and I hope that this is something that the Academy and the public and cultural groups can contribute to for a better future. So thank you very much.
You'll take questions.
Sure, sure.
All right, you'll take questions. Since we're videotaping it, I'm going to pass this around. You'll have to say your question into this microphone. I'll bring it to you if you raise your hand.
I have an answer.
Wait, good. We're going to really give you the microphone if you have an answer.
To your last question, and it's very short because my name is Mary. Listen to Mary on Twitter.com, you know. Yes, because I've written actually exactly what you said there. These loyalties, the Psalms, and actually I say it's vanities, and we can add gender vanities also. And of course men have always ruled, and finally we're giving women a little bit of a say. Here I am, right? But to answer your question, that last one about the loyalties and the nation state, I think the Psalm and the Quran does say that there will be a nation of all nations, and this is the United States of America. And I'm hoping that the example, that the theory upon which America is based will spread and be accepted by all these people that can't seem to stop fighting and killing each other. So that's my short answer.
Anyone else?
No,
you don't have to do anything.
that because of that.
It's for
okay.
the
I like the fact that you said there's no such a thing called Muslim wall, and I think even President Obama realized that and started calling Muslim communities. State Department and others, they changed the name from Muslim wall to Muslim communities. But I would like this is to ask you for your, the last question that you asked about loyalty, the dynamic between minorities versus majorities.
yes.
In the issue of defining this issue of akhlaq and so forth. Muslim in India, for example, were a very powerful minority, but were ruling minority, versus Muslims now in the West, or minorities in the majority, non-Muslim, and the other issue of religious minority in the majority Muslim countries, because this issue being raised all the time in the various discussions. I was at State Department this morning,
Oh.
and we had that discussions about religious minorities, and always, most of the time, the question about religious minorities is a burden on Muslims, that the religious minorities are not being treated well.
Could you
this kind
repeat
of
that last?
the issue of the loyalty to the state in
Ah,
terms of minority. Are you defining people by religion or by citizenship?
Yeah.
In terms of religious minority in the majority Muslim countries versus also religious minority in the Western?
Yeah, it's getting very complicated. I mean, part of the Islamophobia campaign draws upon a well-established attack on minorities that was used to question the loyalty of Catholics and Jews. In other words, that they couldn't be citizens of a, quote, secular state. So the same argument is now being made against Muslims. And so it is a kind of a spurious argument in a sense, because it goes against some pretty deep elements in American religious history. You know, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson made some important acknowledgments about the legitimacy of non-Christian perspectives, although that was kind of theoretical. But I'm reminded that in 1789 there was a constitutional convention in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where I'm from. I'm not Fayetteville, but and they had a debate about the question whether or not there should be a religious test for the presidency of the United States. And so somebody said, well, what if the president is a Mohammedan? And so there was a big debate about this, but eventually the decision was made, the vote was taken to choose Jefferson's position. There should not be any test. So even this was discussed, by the way, when Obama was in his first electoral campaign. It was kind of an interesting coincidence that he was being accused of as being a secret Muslim. But there's another thing that's happening that I think is kind of interesting, which is that on a kind of social level, the term Muslim is almost becoming kind of like an ethnic identifier in the U.S. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because you have people of a lot of different ethnic backgrounds, but there is a sense of solidarity, so that it's functionally being treated as if it's similar to an ethnic identity like Irish or Italian or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily make sense, and it's not necessarily consistent. But I think the issue of citizenship is really important. And the other thing I would mention, there's a lot of things we could talk about here, but the attacks on Sharia law make a grossly exaggerated claim that there is some kind of danger to the American legal system being turned into a sub-branch of Islamic law. I mean, this is simply not possible. But the implications of these amendments and these laws that have been passed in a number of different states are that no reference can be made to Islamic law in any kind of legal decision. And so this would have the potential to do things like make it impossible for marriage contracts or funeral rituals. I mean, really basic kind of religious practices, not to mention contracts with countries where there's, you know, a somewhat different legal system, which happens all the time, by the way. So, or, you know, interest-free banking or whatever. I mean, the American system has actually done pretty well to accommodate things like disputes over church property in the Catholic Church according to canon law. I mean, in other words, they follow the custom of the internal community. I don't think this is an issue, but we just have to clarify that citizenship is a larger concept than that. But it has to be worked out within each country, because the nation state is where this is all defined, and there are some cases where nations delegitimize certain religious groups, or I mean, in Iran, the Baha'i religion is illegal, and there are other cases like this. So the power of the state is pretty significant.
Do you have a question back there?
Yeah, I was just curious.
Here, pass it back.
Thinking of the Hadith collection you mentioned, the Mishkat al-Anwar, I guess I'm not as familiar with there. I guess in the Hadith there's sort of 6 recognized collections of like Bukhari and Muslim.
Yeah.
And how does this particular one rank within that or compare?
Yeah, I miswrote the title. It's Mishkat al-Masabi, but leave that aside. There are a lot of later compilations that are organized differently. I mean, you're right in referring, there's 6 major collections that were given central authority, and then there's a few extra, 3 or 4 extra ones that are also referred to quite heavily, but there are later ones which were used for a variety of purposes, and one of the purposes was a subject index. In other words, that you could look it up by, if you're curious about a particular topic, like prayer, you could find out all the hadith sayings. And so there's a lot of later compilations, and this was a very widely used one, and I picked it up at a madrasa academy in India where it's on the curriculum today.
Any other questions?
I have a question about how you find the attitudes of your students there in North Carolina. Are they open to a variety of ways of approaching religion? Are they, I assume they're curious if they sign up for your class.
Yeah.
But how do you find them?
Well, I mean, it's true that North Carolina is considered to be part of the Bible Belt, and we do have there's a lot of churches in North Carolina, and when I teach Islamic civilization in the fall, I'll have 180 students in my class. And they're partly there, to fulfill certain requirements of the curriculum. But I see a lot of people who are really interested and excited. I mean, I do think the growth and interest in Islam started before 9/11, and with one of my colleagues, Charles Kurzman, we wrote an article about the Islamic studies and Middle East studies in the U.S., and we have some numbers in there because my colleague is a sociologist, and so we have some data about the number of academic positions, and so the growth of the field. And it was starting to grow in the 1990s, but after 9/11 there was a big jump. But I think that what I have seen, and it's true we have perhaps a different composition of students than you might get at Georgetown or Columbia, because 80% of our students come from within the state. But it's also, we have increasing diversity within the state with immigrants and different religious groups. But I feel that recently, in the last 10 or so years, there's been a remarkable sea change. And Arabic is now part of the consciousness of the students. We have close to 300 students taking Arabic at UNC. And Middle East studies has really gone up as a huge factor. So I think that there's been a big shift, perhaps comparable to what happened in the Sputnik era with the sudden awareness of Russia and China. I don't think it's going to go away very soon. And some people are interested in joining the CIA and the military, but other people want to study poetry and history. So that's good.
I think in your comment in the first paragraph about the Islam, the West versus Islam,
Yeah.
I could assume, and which is maybe I'm wrong, but it's a risky assumption, that in the mentality of the Muslim community at large, they grew up with the West, where the Crusades always, even it's a geographical or direction, just as a West, but the nature of is the relationship between majority Muslim countries, like in the Middle East to an extent, if I could say, and Europe. That relationship established this concept called Islam versus the West.
Well, I
You
think
follow?
it's interesting you raised the example of the Crusades, because I think that the indications are that basically everybody forgot about the Crusades for a long time. Shakespeare doesn't have any plays about the Crusades. Isn't that kind of interesting? They came back in 1800 with Sir Walter Scott in Ivanhoe. 1800, that's kind of interesting. The dawn of the colonial era. And I think that at the same time, the notion of the Crusades was revived in the Middle East because people were hearing it being discussed by the British and the French. So I think it reflects, a modern colonial consciousness rather than a primordial difference. I mean, if you look at the Arabic sources to talk about Europe, they speak about the Farang. And that was kind of undifferentiated French folks over there. And, Ibn Khaldun has an interesting remark. He's writing in North Africa at the end of the 13th century, and he says, "We have heard rumors that in the northern cities of the Franks, there are students of philosophy who read the works of the ancients, but we don't have any proof of this. God knows best." Sir.
I'm going to stand over here for an obvious reason, which is it's close to the door. And I have to move my car.
I have to look you out.
That you have to, Norton. First, thank you so much for your forward thinking. I have a question and a comment. I'll start with the comment. Tomorrow, we're going to have a press conference at 10 o'clock at the National Press Club to respond to the barbarism of Boko Haram.
Oh. Yeah.
The question is, to what degree do you see efforts being made by activist scholars, the ones who aren't writing the book for the five,
Right.
to move the modern Islamic thought away from its sort of medieval feudal foundations? This would include, obviously, concepts like ijtihad. But I'm asking, to what degree do you see a movement of scholar intellectual activists who are drawing us into a new interpretation of the Quranic narrative and the prophetic tradition?
Wow, that's a big one. Well, I had the privilege to know a couple of other great scholars who left us recently, including Nasser Hamad Abu Zaid, the Egyptian scholar who was heavily criticized by conservatives in Egypt and, in fact, was run out of the country, and his marriage was annulled for his attempts to deal with the Quran in a new fashion. And also Muhammad Arkoun, the North African scholar, who sometimes was pretty darn complicated, by the way. He was not so much of a public intellectual as he used a lot of French postmodern theory and kept people guessing what he really thought. But I'm struck by the fact that the works of Abu Zaid are translated into Persian and to Indonesian, and a lot of people in different parts, different Muslim societies are engaging with that kind of thinking, as well as with modern social thought, anthropology, which doesn't necessarily have a hostility or, impure danger for Muslims, but I think which offers new ways of reading texts. And so also I point to colleagues of mine like Omid Safi, who's actually moving over from UNC to Duke to a different role. But if you read his posts on Huffington and so forth, he's definitely a public intellectual who's bringing in new tools of thinking. Ibrahim Musa, who's on his way to Notre Dame, is another one. So I think that there's a great opportunity to have this kind of dialogue, and there are people who are taking advantage of it. There are places that are being very conservative, and there are institutions in the Middle East which regard certain types of philosophy, anthropology, social thinking coming out of Europe and America as dangerous. I think that it's an opportunity, because if people like Al-Ghazali in their day could deal with the new intellectual tools that were available, why wouldn't you want to take advantage of the ones that are here today? But that's my opinion. But I think it's going to happen.
We'll take
Yeah.
one or two more questions.
Thank you, Norton, for letting me out. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm going to make it short. There is a term that has gained currency recently as an attempt to reconcile the citizenship as a social contract within the nation state. And this idea of the global culture, globalization, and all, that is the idea of the global citizen. And so I was in Malaysia a few months back, and I was talking to a group of students about what should the university, like the university, produce. What kind of students are we looking for? And so I introduced this idea of the global citizen. And some of the students were pretty hostile to it.
Did you use the word cosmopolitan? Because that's what it means.
I use global citizen.
That's interesting.
And
yeah.
and so some of them were hostile to it because they think intellectually it's a hypocritical kind of coinage, which is contradictory in terms. But then they see it as a camouflage for domination by globalization and dynamic, and so they were not friendly when you pose an idea like that for the resolution of the problem of education. And so, what do you think of this?
Well, I've spent time in Malaysia, and I'm very fond of my friends in the universities there, and there's some great scholars and so forth. But they also have inherited a legacy of thinking which is very addicted to the separation between Islam and the West. And I think in particular of the writings of Sayyid Naguib al-Attas, who was a very fine scholar, but he got into this sort of ideological framework, and it basically flips the colonial opposition in the other direction, where the Europeans were saying that they were superior civilization with science and all this kind of thing, and the Asians were superstitious and barbarians. The reversal of that is to say that Europe and America are materialist, but the East is spiritual. And there are Indians and there are people in the Middle East and others who've adopted this kind of reversal of colonialism, but I think it's stuck in the same trap. And I think that in Malaysia there's also part of the colonial system. If you go into the old Malay palaces, they always have this very dusty museum display that shows the treaties that they made with the British. And it's bilingual in Jawi, Malay, and English. And the English got the commercial rights over the economy, and the sultans kept the control over religion and custom. And so in Malaysia, unlike Indonesia, you have this very feudalistic concentration of authority that's tied to religion. And so I think that reinforces a kind of it's a narrow perspective. There's some blinkers there, which I don't see in Indonesia, where they have a different historical experience. So I have given talks like this in Malaysia to try to get them to move away from that West versus Islam, and I would hope that they'll take that hint as a positive one and not a subversive erosion of their traditions.
We'll take two more questions.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question is, again, related to the dichotomy Islam and the West. I mean, I mentioned to you that I'm interested in the psychology of Muslim immigrant communities. So if you look, for example, in Muslim immigrant communities in Europe, we have this, as you are familiar with that notion of ghurba, basically to feel like a stranger, to feel alienated. And while I definitely agree that there's a, construction on the Western side, Islam versus the West, the same is true also in the psychology of especially first generation of Muslims who come to the country. Like my parents, for example, there was always this notion, we are gharib here. This is something, it's almost like a lack of sacredness. Like there is a construction of sacred areas that God's presence is more visible or more felt in certain areas where, for example, the gharb, where you don't feel the West, where you don't feel God's presence as much. So how do we deconstruct this kind of psychology? How do we empower Muslim immigrant or Muslim communities where they then feel, just like the Quranic notion that God is the world of Rabbul Maghribain wa Rabbul Mashriqain. So basically the both of the West and the East. And I think this construction, it's present in Muslim psychology somewhat, which is a hindrance to really feel that I'm here, it's a sacred presence, and God is visible. And I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, I'm reminded of the the treatise by the Persian philosopher Sohrawardi, which was called Al-Ghurbat al-Gharbiyya, the Occidental Exile. But he was talking about it in a metaphysical sense, where the West was the world of matter, and you tried to go to the world of light instead. The thing is, there are Islamic resources for lots of different approaches to this. And I would pick the phrase, La Sharqiyya wa la Gharbiyya. There's neither of the East nor the West. There's a very important phrase in the light verse from the Quran, which talks about the light, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, and it's compared to a light that's coming from a lamp that's sustained by an oil of a mystical tree that is neither of the East nor the West. And so that was, by the way, a slogan, neither East nor West, that Khomeini used to sort of say neither America nor Russia. But I think there are resources in Islamic tradition for looking at the universe as fully reflective of the divine purpose. And also, I think that there can be made a very good case for the understanding of the history of different societies in Europe and America as a suitable subject for reflection about the nature of religion and throughout the history of the world, and not simply in a critical, negative fashion. And Islam has been part of the history of Europe for over 1,000 years, from the time of Arab Spain, of Andalus. And you know, I find it quite striking, for instance, the oldest examples of poetry written in a Romance language are in Hebrew script and Arabic script. They're from the Muwashaha poems, where you find a refrain at the end of the poem that's in Castilian or mixed Castilian and Arabic. And for those of you who know Spanish, there's one that I remember where this woman is replying to the poet, and she says, "No me tocas, ya habibi." Don't touch me, baby. But it's mixed Spanish and Arabic. But it's written in Hebrew script and it's written in Arabic script. And this is about the year 900 or 1,000. So this is a couple of hundred years before Romance languages were written in the Latin script for modern poetry. So we have this kind of deep, you know, reflection of Arabic and also, interestingly, Hebrew culture at the same time as part of Europe in ways that European you know, anti-Semites and Islamophobes don't want to recognize. And Islam has been part of American history too, although in a kind of a subaltern fashion. And the example that I like to think of for my students is a figure named Omar ibn Sayyid. And he was sold into slavery in Senegal and brought to the U.S. in about 1807 and lived his life as a slave in North Carolina, where he wrote his autobiography in Arabic. And if you haven't heard about this case, I think it's just always a real surprise to people. And it's a very unusual document. He says, he's writing in Arabic, and his Arabic got a little bit strange after 30 years as a slave. He wrote about himself in the third person. But he says, Ya Ahla Carolina, people of Carolina. Ya Ahla America, O people of America. And you're waiting to hear him say some real revelation about himself. But then the curtain of slavery descends over him, and he says, my master is a very good master. So that voice is kind of hidden from us. But I think, you know, people could be very struck by the way in which, and there are earlier examples as well, and there's the way in which Jefferson interacted with the Quran, and yeah. Exactly, right.
So when that comes onto the forefront, I think it will also change people's
Right.
students, young generation.
I like that phrase, shared history. I think that's what one could talk about as a game changer for concept.
And the negatives, so that
Yeah,
all the whole lot.
right. Be honest.
Okay. Your last wish, that can we establish ethical communities not based on, you know, nationality, ethnicity,
Right.
loyalty to religion, and so on. I would like to invite you to use your stealth analysis to one verse in the Quran. It is verse 61:9. 61 As-Saf 9. I read it in Arabic quickly because you are proficient in Arabic
Shukran.
more than many. Okay, it says, هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. Translation: It is He, God, who has sent His messenger with guidance and the religion of the truth to stand supreme over all religions, even though the pagans may dislike it. Now, many Muslims will say, of course, he means Islam that will triumph victorious on all other religions. But knowing the Quran, every letter counts, every word counts. The vocabulary is so very, very important. God does not here say Islam. He says to guidance and the religion of the truth. He could have said the religion of Islam. And as you know, Islam means two things: total submission willingly to the will of God, and the regular Islam we hear about. So if you apply your stealth analysis to this, this may come to the same thing, that some true guidance and religion of the truth, which may be, transcending all previous religions. Okay, it is 61:9.
I like that. Very nice indeed.
So do I.
A quick comment.
I just want to make a comment in relation to the question posed here, and I used to teach at the United States Naval Academy, so it's a quintessential American institution in one of the famous old colonial American cities, Annapolis. And there in the midst of Annapolis, you have Kunta Kinte Memorial. Kunta Kinte Memorial, it's called actually Kunta Kinte Alex Haley Memorial, Alex Haley of the Roots fame. So you have a memorial named after a Muslim. Kunta Kinte was a Muslim after all, of course, if you know the Roots and you read, was a predecessor of Alex Haley. So you have a memorial named after a Muslim in a quintessential American town in front of one of the most prestigious American institutions. That in itself, I used to remind my students about that all the time. And it's such a remarkable thing which not many people are even aware of. And I hope that one day somebody doesn't realize that and start a campaign to remove the memorial from the. But it's such an interesting thing.
If you have a picture of it.
I think you can. There is a website. Actually.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Just look
Good.
it up. Kunta Kinte Alex Haley Memorial.
Oh, that's great.
Annapolis.
I appreciate that. That's a great example. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let us thank Professor Carl Ernst.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.